The world of 1914 was a place of great tension. It was a web of empires, all competing for power and influence. Think of it like a forest floor covered in dry leaves, just waiting for a single spark to set it ablaze. In Europe, great nations were bound together by complex treaties and secret alliances. The Triple Entente, which included Britain, France, and Russia, stood opposite the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These agreements meant that if one country went to war, its friends were legally obliged to join the fight. This intricate system was designed to keep the peace, but in reality, it created a domino effect that would soon topple the entire continent into conflict. This fragile peace was shattered on a sunny morning in June 1914. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city of Sarajevo. He and his wife Sophie were traveling in an open-top car, a symbol of imperial power in a region restless for independence. A young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip saw his chance. He was part of a group that wanted to free Slavic peoples from Austro-Hungarian rule. As the Archduke's car passed, Princip stepped forward, raised a pistol and fired 2 shots. Those shots would echo around the world, killing the Archduke and his wife and setting in motion a catastrophic chain of events. The assassination gave Austria-Hungary the excuse it had been looking for. It issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so severe they were almost impossible to accept. When Serbia could not meet every single demand, Austria-Hungary declared war. This was the first domino to fall. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic people in Serbia, began to mobilize its vast army to defend them. Seeing Russia preparing for war, Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, had no choice but to declare war on Russia. The alliance system was now pulling everyone into the fight, whether they wanted it or not. France, bound by its treaty with Russia, was drawn in next, and Germany enacted its long-held Schlieffen Plan. This plan called for a rapid invasion of France through neutral Belgium, hoping to knock France out of the war quickly before turning to face Russia in the east. But the invasion of Belgium had a critical consequence. It outraged Great Britain, which had promised to protect Belgian neutrality. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. In just a few short weeks, a regional dispute in the Balkans had exploded into a full-scale European war. The lamps were going out all over Europe, and they would not be lit again for a very long time. The soldiers who marched off to war in the summer of 1914 believed it would all be over by Christmas. They were filled with patriotic fervor, cheered on by crowds who threw flowers and waved flags. The German plan was to sweep through Belgium and into France, capturing Paris in a matter of weeks. The French had their own plan for a swift, decisive attack, but both sides underestimated the power of modern weapons. The machine gun in particular changed everything. It could cut down lines of advancing infantry with terrifying efficiency, making the old tactics of bold cavalry charges and massed infantry assaults completely obsolete and suicidal. This new reality of warfare quickly led to a brutal stalemate on the Western Front. After the initial German advance was halted at the Battle of the Marne, both sides dug in to protect themselves from the relentless machine gun fire and artillery shells. They dug complex systems of trenches that soon stretched for over 450 miles, from the coast of Belgium all the way to the Swiss border. This network of ditches, dugouts, and tunnels became the defining feature of the war. Between the opposing trench lines lay a desolate and deadly wasteland known as No Man's Land, a hellish landscape of mud, craters, and tangled barbed wire, watched over by snipers and machine gun nests. Life for the ordinary soldier in these trenches was a miserable and terrifying existence. They lived in constant fear of death, not just from enemy attacks but from disease and the elements. The trenches were often flooded with water, creating thick, clinging mud that could swallow a man whole. Rats, grown fat on corpses, scurried everywhere. Lice were a constant torment, spreading a painful illness known as trench fever. The daily routine was a monotonous cycle of standing guard, repairing trenches, and enduring the near-constant threat of artillery bombardment, which could bury men alive in their dugouts. The smell of death, decay, and disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a permanent reminder of the horrors around them. To break this deadlock, commanders on both sides ordered massive, costly offensives. Battles like the Somme and Verdun became infamous for their staggering casualty rates. Generals would order their men to go over the top, climbing out of their trenches and advancing across no man's land towards the enemy lines. They would walk into a storm of machine gun and artillery fire, with thousands being killed or wounded in a matter of minutes for the gain of only a few hundred yards of shattered ground. These futile assaults created a sense of despair and hopelessness among the troops, who felt they were merely cogs in a vast, uncaring machine of death. While the trenches of the Western Front are the most famous image of the war, the conflict was truly a global one. The great European empires dragged their colonies from around the world into the fight. Britain called upon soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and parts of Africa. France conscripted men from its colonies in North and West Africa and Southeast Asia. These soldiers, sailors, and laborers traveled thousands of miles to fight for an empire, often in lands they had never seen, and for a cause they barely understood. They fought with distinction and bravery in every major theater of the war, from the muddy fields of Flanders to the deserts of the Middle East. The war was not just fought on land, it raged across the world's oceans as well. The powerful British Royal Navy and the German High Seas Fleet clashed in the North Sea. The goal was to control the sea lanes, to blockade the enemy and starve them of essential supplies like food and raw materials for their war industries. Germany unleashed a new and terrifying weapon, the U-boat or submarine. These underwater predators prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and warships alike. Their campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare aimed to cripple Britain, an island nation dependent on imports, but it also risked angering neutral countries, most notably the United States. The war also opened up new fronts far from Europe. In the Middle East, British forces, including troops from Australia and India, fought against the Ottoman Empire, an ally of Germany. This campaign was fought in the harsh deserts of Mesopotamia and Palestine. The goal was to seize control of vital oil resources and to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. Famous figures like T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped to inspire an Arab revolt against their Ottoman rulers, promising them independence in return for their help. This redrew the map of the Middle East, with consequences that are still being felt to this very day, creating new countries and new conflicts. Even in Africa and Asia, the war was being fought. The colonies of the German Empire were attacked and seized by Allied forces. In East Africa, a brilliant German general named Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a small force of African soldiers on a remarkable guerrilla campaign that tied down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops for the entire duration of the war. In the Pacific, Japan, an ally of Britain, seized German territories in China and the Pacific Islands. The Great War was not just a European civil war, it was a world war, a conflict that touched every continent and reshaped the global balance of power forever. For years, the war had been a grinding stalemate, a war of attrition where each side tried to bleed the other dry. However, two major events in 1917 would dramatically change the course of the conflict and pave the way for its end. The first was the Russian Revolution. Years of staggering losses, food shortages, and political unrest finally boiled over in Russia. The Tsar was overthrown, and after a period of chaos, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. They had promised the Russian people peace, land, and bread, and they quickly made good on their promise of peace by signing a treaty with Germany and withdrawing from the war, closing the Eastern Front for good. This was a huge victory for Germany. It could now move hundreds of thousands of its best troops from the Eastern Front to the West, hoping to launch one final massive offensive to win the war before America could make its presence felt. The second major event of 1917 was the entry of the United States into the war. For years, America had remained neutral, though it supplied the Allies with money and goods. However, Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which included the sinking of American ships, and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico proposing an alliance against the United States, finally pushed President Woodrow Wilson to ask Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917. The arrival of American troops, known as doughboys, provided a much-needed boost to the exhausted Allied armies. They were fresh, well-equipped, and full of fighting spirit, a stark contrast to the war-weary French and British soldiers who had endured years of trench warfare. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched its massive final attack, the Spring Offensive. They threw everything they had at the Allied lines, using new stormtrooper tactics to break through. For a time, it seemed like they might succeed. They pushed the Allies back tens of miles, the greatest advance seen on the Western Front since 1914. But the German army was exhausted and running out of supplies. The Allied forces, now reinforced by the Americans, managed to hold the line. They weathered the storm and then launched their own powerful counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive. Using coordinated attacks with tanks, aircraft, and infantry, the Allies began to push the Germans back relentlessly. The German army, its morale shattered, and its resources depleted, began to collapse. At the same time, Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were also crumbling from within, facing defeat on other fronts and revolutions at home. The end was now in sight. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice was signed, and the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The end of the fighting brought a wave of relief and celebration across the Allied nations, but it left behind a world that was broken and scarred. The Great War had been a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. It had killed around 20 million people, both soldiers and civilians, and wounded millions more. Entire generations of young men in countries like France and Britain had been wiped out. The economic cost was staggering, nations were deep in debt, and vast areas of Europe, particularly in France and Belgium, had been reduced to rubble. The old world of powerful empires and confident monarchies was gone forever, replaced by uncertainty and grief. In 1919, the leaders of the victorious Allied powers, the Big Four from Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, met in Paris to decide the terms of the peace. The conference was held at the Grand Palace of Versailles, and its goal was to create a lasting peace and rebuild the world. However, the different leaders had very different ideas about how to achieve this. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States wanted a peace without victory, based on his idealistic 14 points, which included the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the leaders of France and Britain, whose countries had suffered immensely, wanted revenge and security. They wanted to punish Germany and make sure it could never threaten Europe again. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was largely a compromise between these competing visions, but it was a harsh one for Germany. The treaty forced Germany to accept full blame for the war in the infamous War Guilt Clause. It had to pay enormous financial reparations to the Allies, some so large they would cripple its economy for decades. Germany also lost all of its overseas colonies and significant amounts of its own territory in Europe. Its proud army was dramatically reduced in size, and its navy was scuttled. For many Germans, the treaty was not a peace settlement but a diktat, a dictated peace that they were forced to sign under threat of renewed invasion. The treaty redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East, creating new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia out of the ashes of the old German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. While this was intended to give self-determination to many ethnic groups, it also created new minorities and new tensions that would lead to future conflicts. The League of Nations was created, but without the participation of the United States, which refused to ratify the treaty, it was too weak to enforce its will. The Treaty of Versailles failed to create a lasting peace. Instead, the resentment and economic hardship it caused in Germany helped to create the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of an even more devastating Second World War just 20 years later.